So, Wayne Bradshaw, thanks for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Thanks for having me, James. It's a pleasure to be here.
We are going to be discussing your book, The Ego Made Manifesto, Max Stirner, Egoism and the Modern Manifesto, published by Bloomsbury last year, 2023. This is a book about the philosophy of Stirner and his, or the ego on its own, or the unique in its property, whichever translation you want to go with, the influence of Stirner and egoism and that text on modernism and on thinkers such as Gabriele D'Annunzio and a little bit of art movements, literary movements, and primarily modernism, but looking at Stirner's influence, basically. And I guess just before we get going, one thing I want to say is I find Stirner such an intriguing figure. He's historically speaking, because he is one of these figures who I would argue is completely canonized. The ego on its own is, if there is such a thing as a canon, it's in there. But no one's talking about him. Hardly anyone's talking about him. So that's for me is just a fascinating aspect of any Stirner conversation. So before we get going, a little bit about you, what the genesis of this book, and also what's it like to write about Stirner these days?
Yeah. Well, this book did emerge out of research I conducted for my PhD thesis. Now, a bit of context is probably needed there. My thesis was completed at James Cook University. Now, if you don't know where that is, if you look at a map of Australia and look in the northeast corner, which is quite far away from anything of note, it's definitely far away from what we'd call the metropolitan Australia in the southeast corner. That's the university where I undertook my PhD. It's a good university if you want to study the Great Barrier Reef. It's right on the doorstep of the Great Barrier Reef, great marine science program, great Indigenous studies program in the heart of kind of that field, and a great rural and regional medicine program because, again, it's quite an isolated part of the country. It's a city, but it's at a far remove. Mm-hmm. Not really known for studies in the impact of of post-Hegelian German philosophy on the development of the avant-garde manifesto and modernism in France, in Germany, France, Italy, the Americas, and England. So I give that story because I think it's important to how this particular book came about. I think if I'd written this thesis at any other institution, someone would have told me that's a terrible idea. If I'd written this book anywhere else, someone would have told me that's a terrible idea. Australia's got another Stirner researcher, John Carroll, who produced Breakout from the Crystal Palace, which is kind of most studies of Stirner will at some point refer to Breakout from the Crystal Palace, where he established kind of a triumvirate. And he talks about the similarity between Nietzsche, which I imagine we'll get there. We always get to Nietzsche. The similarities between Stirner, Nietzsche, and Dostoevsky. Mm-hmm. And these are three independent peaks that rose up, in the 19th century. And I was at a book launch that John Carroll was at, and I remember saying to him, he had said something about Nietzsche was very influential, but he was mad, and so we need to take everything he says with a grain of salt because he was quite clearly insane. And I said to him, "Well, yeah, okay, I'll set that point aside, but what about Stirner?" And he said, "Well, that's easy. Nobody read Stirner." That would have been the approach. If I'd done this at most universities, the answer would have been when I said I want to write a book about the influence of Max Stirner on modernist writing on the avant-garde. They would have said that's crazy because nobody read. And of course, we know a lot of people read Stirner just in fits and starts. Everyone got obsessed, and then everyone forgot him, and then everyone got obsessed, and then everyone forgot him.
He does seem to return in cycles. But it is interesting then the fact of no one reads him, and yet we all know his name, which is the strange anomaly of Max Stirner. There's one thing I noted down there about post-Hegelianism, but I know you mentioned that you've been listening to the podcast, and as I said, I don't really bring this question anymore, but I'll bring it in this time once more. The revival, like Max Stirner, a revival of the Hermitix question, mainly because I don't think anyone's put Max Stirner in the room yet. So you can place three thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. Max, or is it Johann Caspar Schmidt? Is that the correct? Is that yeah?
Yeah, Johann Caspar Schmidt.
Or Max Stirner, named after Stern, which is a rather large forehead. Absolutely, we'll get into the biography because even though there's so little of it, it is ridiculous. But Max Stirner is already sat in the room, like smoking cigars, and three other people can enter. Who do you pick?
Okay, I'm glad to have Stirner in the corner. He can sit in the corner and mull. Look, I think what I would just love to be in a room. The other two wouldn't matter, but I will give you another two with George Eliot. I think any party's a party when you've got George Eliot in the room. So we'll put her in there. I would love to sit in a room with Emma Goldman, and I think we'd have some great conversations. And we'd have a Stirner fan in having Emma Goldman in the room. And let's say Albert Camus. That's a great evening's entertainment.
That's a very youthful room.
It is a very
youthful. You really want to party, basically.
Yeah. I want a good dinner. I want a good dinner party. I want to have a good time.
It'd be like that. The what is it? I mean, there's two drawings of Stirner. It'd be like the one where he's stood with the young Hegelians having a party. Is there what the line there? A bit of anarchism, a bit of a party. Are you aligned personally with the? Maybe not. To get into specifics is always difficult, but we could say that underlying current of system critique and anarchism and egoism. That I don't want to place you in a box, but that general atmosphere of sincere rebellion. More than just yeah.
We can say I'm anarchist-ish. Not anarcho-syndicalism. Individualist anarchism is often something that has a taint to it. Like that's a choice to say individualist anarchism. I'm an individualist. I'm an individualist and I'm anarchist, but I would not necessarily call myself an individualist anarchist. Oh.
Okay. So I think I want to
read.
Sorry?
Herbert Reed. I was going to say, if you want to put me in a box, you can put me in a box with Herbert Reed probably, and Max Harris, who's an Australian who, if people don't know that name, look him up. He's interesting too.
Okay, I don't know either of them, unfortunately. So I don't know the box, but I get your point about individualist anarchism. I think, because it's a tough question. I've got the Unique, and it's probably on the desk at the moment. I'm rereading it at the moment, and still, to me, egoism is always at least the idea of egoism is always at least 10% intuitive. There is something that is like, you just have to read this and get this. I can't get about 90% of the way by explaining it theoretically, but there's always this point of you need to go live this now and be confronted with spirits.
Yeah.
What's egoism?
What's egoism?
What is an egoist?
Yeah, what is an egoist? Well, it depends who you ask in terms of who is an egoist, or what is an egoist? Stirner would say on one level, we're all egoists, we can't help but be. The implication of egoism is that if all ideals are spooks haunting us, if every value and every moral and every even right down to the material world, in terms of to the extent to which things are ideas, we ascribe values and ideas to things. A chair is a chair because it's a chair. We all live in a world of spooks, which makes us all egoists. We're just not conscious of it. We're not conscious egoists. So what is egoism then? Well, it is just that. It is a philosophical position that suggests that everything in the world that we can ascribe meaning to, that we can understand, the world that we understand is the product of a self that can never can never have labels ascribed to it. So we generate the world we occupy through being. It's quite mystical to say it's the I am kind of reverberating through the universe. The universe is as I am, and everything that I see, everything that I experience is, to use the Stirnerian concept, is property. It is they are my things. They are the things that I have made. They have come out of me, and that includes people. We can speculate about whether or not other people exist, but for Stirner, that does belong to the realm of speculation. There is the unique. I am the unique. Every person I talk to is a version of that person who I have created. They are my property, and I might enjoy them. Hopefully, I enjoy them. I enjoy their company. I talk to them. But at the end of the day, they are property that I have made, that I own, because they've come out of my being. Everything that exists is the product of that creative nothing, which is the thing, the unnameable. It's like Beckett's unnameable. It is that thing that underneath all of the things. It is that not idea underneath all of the ideas.
So what differentiates this? Because I think it takes a bit of acute reading, and I don't know where you stand on this, but years ago when I was, learning my philosophical basics, Stirner was, as I said, I was like, oh, there's this book that's somehow in the canon, so I'll read it. And at the time, in fact, I'm not even sure if the Unique and Its Property with the Landstreicher translation had even been released. So all I had was the Byington, The Ego on Its Own. And I remember just reading this and being like, this is the driest thing I've ever. I found it so dry. But then, so I put it aside. I read about 50 pages and I couldn't do it. I found it really dry. And then when I read Landstreicher, who emphasizes he in his introduction emphasizes the playfulness and the humor, and he really gets that through. So I think just before we delve into maybe some more specifics of egoism and how to read it, because there's another question there. I mean, how do you feel about the translations? You seem to look at me strange for saying that the original translation is dry.
I think it's funny. I think I see where you're coming from, and I think the problem with the Byington is that it is, because of the context in which it's produced, with Tucker and Byington, you have these natural rights libertarians who have kind of just discovered kind of this very different kind of way to be a libertarian, and that strong influence from Tucker of Proudhon. I think some of the humor, some of the slightly misanthropic humor, some of that kind of let's rip the world to shreds kind of humor and let's take pleasure in it. There's a great line from Camus talking about the difference between Stirner and Nietzsche, and he says they both go down a blind alley. And I think he says that Stirner, the king of all rebels, it laughs in his blind alley while Nietzsche bangs his head against the wall. While Nietzsche's trying to get out, like through the blind alley, Stirner just enjoys it. Stirner revels in kind of the destructiveness of not only breaking every moral code, every law, every ideal, but then breaking them in such a way that breaking reverberates all the way through history. Like, you can never have another ideal. And that's fun. It is fun to wreck things. He is the kid kicking over the sandcastle. I get even that. That's even in Byington. But I do understand what you mean. That it's sort of, there's a seriousness to that translation that undermines some of.
The reason I emphasize just the differences in translation is that the way you described egoism, I think it's a great description. Don't get me wrong. I'm no expert, but when you first read it, I think it takes an acute reading to at times differentiate it between, like as you said, this notion of, if you'd say someone, "Oh, my philosophy is that everyone is my creation," and they're just like they're literally my creation. Do you think you're the only conscious human being? This like basically a radical solipsism of everyone else is just an NPC, and I'm the only existing human being, and that's all that matters. And I think at times one could be forgiven if they mistook Stirner's writing at times for, like, hang on, how does this differentiate from basically an insane selfishness? And I think that's an important part of egoism, right? Is hang on, are you just saying, like, I can do what I want as long as it's within my power, I can just do what I want? It's yeah. So what's the differentiation? Because I think that allows us to hone in on egoism, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think of that great philosophical question of the subject-object bridge. And I think if I'm understanding your question right, I think an interesting part of what Stirner's doing is changing the nature of the questions around the subject-object bridge. That the realm of objectivity becomes the grounds of speculation for Stirner in that regard. Other people become things that may or may not exist. And but that doesn't necessarily have any implication for how one should live one's self out or what one should desire to do. I think I am wary to kind of talk about kind of a Heideggerian notion of authenticity around that. But it's probably not unrelated. This idea that when everybody else becomes speculative, it doesn't mean that you objectify everybody and turn them into things and turn them into other people or things. But the grounds of the way one approaches life shifts to that notion of living oneself out, of making the world a world that reflects not some value, or that doesn't let values get away from you. It's constantly being present, and making a world that you can live with, rather than one that reflects values.
Now, from this, we can segue into your book, and this for me is one of the spicy questions. I know I've got two because you replied and you said you were looking forward to two of them. But if everything is from this creative nothing, and I believe that's the subtitle of, is it the Renzo Novatore book? His collection, creative, something along those lines. Anyway, everything's from this creative nothing, and each is, for Stirner, their own god. And there is, I guess, those biblical elements which we could possibly turn to at some point in the book. It has this very strange utilization of Bible quotes in a really funny way. Everything's from the creative nothing. One is their own god. So can it be, if you are an egoist who is creating all things, maybe you've removed and destroyed all these ideals, and you're sort of maybe starting. Well, you're not starting again for Stirner.
Assuming
you have that realization that all is folly and can be just created from nothing. Can you then, from that, be an egoist first, but then you say, right, well, I'm going to create from this nothingness a leftism, a rightism. So you could be an egoist fascist, an egoist communist. Could it be that you could be an egoist fascist, but not a fascist egoist? And the only reason I mentioned fascism, because in relation to your book, a figure who will likely come up is one Gabriele D'Annunzio, who is so egoist fascist or fascist egoist. You can't be the latter. I don't think so.
No. You could, yeah. I get where you're going with that, and again, if I'm interpreting it correctly, Morris, yeah, you can defend virtually any value you want with egoism, but it's a very contingent kind of defense. You can defend fascism with egoism, but that defense is that I will it so, which has no bearing on anything else beyond to the extent that I want to make the world look fascist, or I want to behave in a way that I conceive of as being fascist, I will it to be. I will do that until someone hits me over the back of the head or arrests me. I'm going to do whatever I want. I'm going to, I'm going to set up a fascist club.
Mm.
Yeah, and you can defend any value. You can defend communism from that perspective. I mean, Engels even says that we need to, in his immediate response to reading Stirner's book, and he says we are communists out of egoism also. Yeah, you can defend any value. You can even defend anarchism, which Stirner does not strictly defend either, because freedom's no less an ideal for being freedom. It's still a value. It's if you ground all of your activity around the advancement of freedom in the world, then that isn't necessarily egoist, but if it's what you will, then so be it. So yes, I think that's a contingent yes. Yes, you can be an egoist anything, but it doesn't necessarily mean that egoism can defend anything, because at one hand it gives, with the other it takes away, because the very same logic of egoism dismantles any value the moment it becomes a value beyond the whims of an individual in a given moment.
I think it's contingent on a sort of Stirner's understanding of power. Like, as long as you can hold it, then it's there. You think this is the case with D'Annunzio?
Oh, for a period while he holds Fiume. Yeah, I mean, it's a strange thing. I often find myself thinking about a figure like Gustave Le Bon, and I think Stirner's in a similar position, because on one level he provides a set of tools. Like he provides a philosophy, but that philosophy can very easily be co-opted into a set of tools. So whatever the value, whether or not Le Bon's crowd theory is true or not, it's quite an effective way of manipulating people. And egoism can be used in a similar way. I mean, we'll probably, I imagine, we'll get to manifestos. And this is where, once you admit to yourself that you're not going to believe in anything, then you can believe in everything, if it's convenient. I mean, D'Annunzio is a figure that is the mode of D'Annunzio, someone who will do whatever he believes, say anything to make his life look like he wants it to look, to get what he wants to get. And I mean, we talk about objectifying people, like reducing people to mere property. Yeah, that's D'Annunzio does reduce everyone around him to mere property. They are things, means to ends.
Other than his dogs.
Other than his dogs. Other than his greyhound.
Yeah. So you mentioned the manifesto there. So you think from this creative nothing, you mentioned this notion of sort of convenience with D'Annunzio. I mean, there's a couple of questions here. I mean, one's almost psychoanalytical, but from this creative nothing, manifestos begin to arise. And do you think this is what they are? They're modes of convenience. And with respect to that, why I mentioned it's psychoanalytical is, do you think, I mean, this is completely, I guess, really rhetorical, but do you think from that is we're actually quite terrified of the creative nothing, and we think, well, actually, I want to get back. I need rules again. Here's why I believe. Here's the guidebook, because I can't, you can't just sit in the creative nothing all day.
No, it's terrifying, right? It's terrifying to be unhinged when every single anchor, every possible avenue for having a decision already made for you is gone. The total freedom of being able to do whatever you want, with no accountability beyond the extent of your own individual power, beyond your capacity to defend your own actions against, the material world. That's terrifying. Yeah, and I do think the manifesto as I see it, I mean, there are two voices within the manifesto, and I talk about in the book this idea that so Martin Puchner has written very well on the manifesto from kind of this other view, which is so he describes the manifesto as credo plus history, and he finds its origins in Marx's manifesto, and sees in it this kind of bringing together, this capacity to unify people under a collective voice that isn't necessarily written collectively, but in the moment of a reading, of reception, it becomes kind of a collective thing.
Mm-hmm.
I was interested in the other end of that, which is the individual manifesto writer exploiting that very fact, the fact that people want to come together under a set of shared values. They want a community. And obliterating or promising to obliterate existing unfair rules, unfair ideas, unfair, whether they're artistic or whether they're political, or whether they're ethical, of obliterating a set of law tables, doing the Nietzschean thing of breaking all the law tables, but then doing the Nietzschean thing of writing new ones. And in the case of the manifesto writer, then creating a community, ascribing the boundaries of a community and saying, this is what we believe, which puts anyone reading the manifesto in a tricky bind, because they reject the manifesto but in doing so reject the label of that community. When Marx says we as communists believe whatever, well, the communism is this. You agree with Marx and be a communist, or you repudiate Marx and no longer fit the manifesto. So you're in a position where you either have to reject the very existence of the manifesto, the relevance of the manifesto, or kind of come within its sway. And both things require you to effectively acknowledge the manifesto. Both ends. Even the rejection is an acknowledgement. There is no not participating from the moment the manifesto is written, even, really. So it becomes a really useful weapon for not only demolishing old ideals, for writing that credo plus history, so writing sort of the way that history is inevitably moving towards a shift in value. It does that bit, but it also kind of creates this magic circle. It has this binding effect on everyone who comes in contact with the manifesto. They're either with us or against us,
To draw on a little bit of the history then, because, Stirner's history it's just kind of strange and then non-existent. So there's about these sort of 3 years where he was the guy, the figure, and probably shot himself in the foot by doing that and took himself out of his job because he knew that, no one's going to employ me when I've just destroyed everything. And then he disappears, and the book and pretty much almost everything about him disappears. If it wasn't for McKay, we probably wouldn't know anything at all. When does it start to sort of pick up in terms of direct influence and people saying, right, this thing that I've created is influenced by Stirner? What does that look like?
Yeah. Well, late 1880s, if we're talking about kind of that second wave, because you say it does appear, it explodes on the scene in 1844, attracts the thunderbolts from all the reigning giants. Everyone wants to have a go. Very briefly, the only person who doesn't get stuck in that very brief window when Stirner's relevant is Marx, who's too busy writing 300 pages about Stirner. I'm going to write the demolition. I'm going to do the demolition of Stirner, and by the time it's done, no one will publish it. No one even knows who Stirner is anymore. So that's that end of that first wave. The second one happens in the 1880s, late 1880s. A good deal of it can be attributed to the French obsession with Germany during and following the Franco-Prussian War. So you get this peculiar kind of thing where, because Germany is relevant, you get this fascination with German culture, with German ideas, and you get, and this is where it's interesting for me, because my project at one point was, what was the influence, what united the radical political manifesto with the artistic manifesto?
Mm.
And I didn't know the answer to that, and I would argue now the answer is Stirner, because what you see in the 1880s in Paris is translations of Max Stirner appearing, and this kind of comes through Mackay. So Mackay sort of rediscovers Stirner in a German context, and then it comes to Paris through the symbolist journals, journals like the Revue Bleue, which start publishing little snippets of Stirner, often in the context of the origins of anarchism. Which is, it's a strange thing, because, you know, Stirner is in a lot of ways, I think, the antithesis of kind of mainstream anarchist thought in Paris in the late 1880s. But this fascination with German philosophy, that you start to see Stirner and Nietzsche appearing more and more, and, you know, Paris being the center of culture in that period, center of European culture, and you know, it spreads like wildfire to Italy, where Marinetti really, I think, in a large part brings those kind of values from the Paris literary scene to Italy, and then through strange circuitous kind of chains of events, it ends up in the American libertarian scene, and then ends up in English modernism, where you get these wildly different interpretations of Stirner, because, you know, as we've said, Stirner can be all things to all people, right? So you end up with Maurice Barr advancing, using Stirnerian values to denounce laws in ways that espouse French nationalism. The Terre et les Morts, the Earth and the Dead, which is terrifyingly close to Blut und Boden. Marinetti takes it in wild directions, again, nationalistic. But, you know, as I said, you can use, as we were discussing, you can use egoism to defend just about anything, as long as you're willing to accept the grounds upon which you're defending it. As long as you accept that I will is a sufficient defense for any value, then egoism can defend any value. So you can defend futurism, you can defend vorticism, you can defend Dadaism. And we see that.
And am I right in thinking there was a bit of a revival in the 80s as well? So 90s?
Oh.
No,
sorry?
Like the 1980s?
Oh, now I'll take your word for it, because we're outside my
Okay. Well, no, I was just the question I was going to ask from that is this sort of cyclic Stirnerian current that keeps coming back. And I guess with respect to the manifesto, with respect to the times that these things are written in, maybe the places, the tumult, do you see a connection between Stirnerian revivals? Do you see a reason as to why people in these times go, you know what, we need egoism right now?
Yeah, I mean, it could be the world gets a little bit too structured. That's interesting, because, I mean, I think then about that the first and second wave, the German one, and then that one that happens in the 80s, 90s, that sort of goes all the way up to the 1915 and the First World War, kind of is such a scale of mass demolition, you know, of mass destruction, that I think everybody loses the taste for it. So yeah, I think there's probably something to that when things feel a little bit perhaps too ordered, that people who want to mix things up a little bit perhaps tend to stumble across Stirner, and he re-enters the zeitgeist perhaps. And then we get. Yeah, I'm thinking there of Camus and Laurent Revolté, and sort of his discussion of Stirner in that context, where Stirner is kind of the king of rebels. Yeah, so when we get a taste for rebellion in the 1980s, there's a time of rebellion, you know. When we get a taste for rebellion, you're eventually going to follow. If you follow rebellion back to its king, to its source, you get to Stirner.
It's something you point out. I mean, just to quickly mention it in here is with regards to the work of Camus, Stirner's all but erased, right?
Yeah, in the translation.
Yeah, in the translation.
Immediately.
Sorry, immediately.
Immediately. There is at least it's a bit like the German ideology. I mean, Stirner get 300 pages of Stirner get erased from there pretty well immediately. And he gets erased from Camus, from The Rebel, in the first English translation, but at least there's a note to say that some stuff's been cut. If you get a copy now, unless you get the vintage, which I think is only available in the United States at the moment, if you get the vintage, you can get the unabridged. But the other editions, the Penguin and most other editions that are kind of built off that, are not listed as abridged, but they are abridged. And the lion's share of that abridgment is Stirner. L'Autrement and Stirner are the two who get cut. And I'm very interested why. It's on my list of things to do is to chase down the why and the how of that.
Do you have any inkling at the moment of this, as to why there's this Stirnerian conspiracy?
I suspect that it is because he is broadly deeply unpopular. And not deeply unpopular. That's not quite the right way. But he has an awful lot of enemies. When you start to talk about Stirner's, particularly in the context of Stirner's influence, the two big names, which when you talk about Stirner's influence, they are Karl Marx and Friedrich Nietzsche. And there are a lot of people who will die on the hills of Karl Marx and Friedrich Nietzsche in terms of how innovative they were, how new their ideas were. And reading the influence on Karl Marx of Stirner takes quite a bit of wind out of the sails, because his overturning of idealism, his challenge to his refiguring of the nature of experience, of reducing experience in part to historical context, that we are all products of our historical context, of the means of production, is, when you read Marx in the context of Stirner, is just an inversion of what Stirner proposed, which was similarly to reduce experience to the individual. And then Marx becomes the other side of a coin, and that's a far less innovative Marx. When the critique of Feuerbach, which the thesis on Feuerbach, when the critique of Feuerbach becomes a refiguring of a preceding critique on Feuerbach by Stirner, which it is, then it's a far less innovative Marx. And the same kind of applies to Nietzsche, that Nietzsche becomes, in some respects, I won't go so far as to say backwards, but a lot of Nietzsche's innovations are not necessarily the same innovations that they are when you read the context of Stirner. The breaking of law, like the figure, the lawbreaker, Verbrechen, that's Stirner says a lot of that. And in some respects, he goes further, because at that point, he even says, he doesn't say we need to make a law of ourselves. He just says we need to keep breaking the laws into infinity, effectively. We always need to be consuming ideals. We always need to be making ideals contingent. And I mean, that's that notion that Camus says about Nietzsche banging his head against the wall. Stirner knows where he is, and he's happy about it.
I think it's a couple of things there. I mean, one thing I want to say, and I said this on, I did tweet this a while back to a few people who quote tweeted it with much annoyance. And I will say I have a great Nietzsche scholar on the podcast regularly, Paul Bishop. So, Paul, I'm sorry, but I would say that, and I did say, and I just think I do genuinely believe that Max Stirner did more in his single book than Nietzsche did in his entire oeuvre. That's me saying that. No one else. But I do see it that way. And like you said, you go back, you read Stirner, even if that's, there's no way to verify what I've said there, and many people would be very up in arms about it. But definitely, I think we can agree with what you said about it takes the wind out of the sails of, oh, hang on. This is kind of, don't want to do the whole, oh, someone did that before, but it's like this, especially when it's around the same time and that same atmosphere. It's like, this has been done, and it did go much further and actually took the implications to the nth degree.
Yeah.
But I think from that brings in a very sort of intellectual historian question, I guess, of popularity, because Nietzsche is arguably he's the pop philosopher. Sorry to say, Nietzsche, God is Dead has got a real some real bite. I mean, you find that on posters all around the world.
Yeah, but again, that's Stirner. Stirner's declaring that Stirner's on a god.
Do you think the popularity and the love of Nietzsche is because he keeps in just enough to keep us, like, we haven't completely lost everything there, and he begins to add in, okay, this might all be gone, but like that the panic of Nietzsche of like, what can I quickly bring, or what can I bring in, the Übermensch, whatever it might be, active nihilism. He brings something in. We've lost all our anchors, we've become nothing. Okay, quickly I need to find something. Whereas Stirner is, as you said with the alleyway example, Stirner's happy to just laugh down the alleyway. Yeah. Do you think that's why, like, Nietzsche just gives us a bit more comfort?
Yeah, no, I think that's, I agree with you. I think that Nietzsche provides a way out. So once everything is gone, he's like, well, we can build something for ourselves. And there's a degree to which that rings of, well, you can lift yourself up by your bootstraps. I'll sit back and watch while you do it. Whereas, Stirner kind of gets to that point and he says, okay, here we are, live yourself out. And that's literally just live yourself out. Everything's gone. Nothing has meaning beyond. And this is where kind of it's do you view? There is certainly, I know some people do view Stirner as kind of that first existentialist, that first kind of, I don't think he is, because there is no room for becoming in Stirner. There is nothing for you to become. You already are all that you can be. You already are you. I am, not I am going to be, not I am going to become. I already am. Where was I going with that? Nietzsche does purport to provide a way out of that situation, but why? Stirner says, why would you ever want a way out of that situation, even if there was one?
Is the Übermensch an egoist?
No.
Why not?
No, because the Übermensch is an ideal. The Übermensch is something to aspire to. Stirner would say, why would you aspire to be that? Why would you want to bend yourself? Why would you want to alter yourself to make way for something? Why would you want to, I mean, really with the Übermensch, why would you want to destroy yourself to make way for something better? There is no better. There's nothing better than me. I'm already the best. I'm the best I can ever be because I am.
So do you think a lot of the Stirner's influence, I mean, he has this thing, the whole thing of the creative nothing. And so it's like, I get this impression, I mean, any talk of his biography, really, after the main 3 years, there's basically nothing there other than a couple of little bits when he's dying, and even then, most of his old friends don't even come and come and see him. I got the impression, I mean, it's just completely, of course, rhetorical and basically just almost like a fantasy, but the impression I got from Mackay's biography with regards to basically that second weird half of Stirner's life where he just disappears is like a man who has truly encapsulated and gone, you know what, I can't, what do I do now? Like he accepted his philosophy, he truly accepted his philosophy and what to do. And so the reason I say
started daring.
Sorry?
Start a dairy. That's what you
Start
do.
a dairy,
Start
which
a dairy,
uh,
fail, and spend
yeah,
all your wife.
yeah, and then she
She
divorces
comes
you.
here. She comes to Australia.
She's a kind
She
of
wants
quite a miserable life, I think, or something like that. Or maybe that was
Hmm.
McKay's sort of. I don't know,
Yeah.
but the reason I say that is because do you think then that in this sort of moment of Stirner's like, well, look, this is what I've done. Not sure how you'd go anywhere from here. Is that what we see with your book, with the manifestos, with people like D'Annunzio, with Marinetti? Is this all abuse of Stirner?
Yeah, I mean, it couldn't help but be. I mean, even in his own, even at in that first flush of relevance, um, I might have said it earlier, but no one recognizes what he's arguing. No one sees the implications of what he said. I mean, the response from most critics, including Feuerbach, is that, oh, well, the creative nothing it's just another ideal, but it's a nihilistic ideal. When that's not the implication. The implication is that all value comes from some kind of self that whenever you try to identify it slips your grasp. There is something prior to all ideals, and we can only kind of gesture at it. We can gesture at the direction of it. And so it isn't nihilistic in that regard, but his critics read him as a nihilist. Marx, I would say, willfully misread him as an idealist. No one understood him at the time, and I don't think anyone's understood him since, and I wouldn't purport to say I quite understand everything he says either. It's like you said at the very start of the interview when you said, there is a degree of egoism that you just have to experience. The I am, you just have to go out and be. To live and to enjoy. Egoism is having a glass of wine in a bar and listening to the hubbub of conversation and just kind of taking that moment in.
Or it's not.
Or it's not, right? If you don't want to. Whatever you want to
That's
do.
The problem.
Do what you want to do.
That's the problem. What's egoism? It's that, but it's also definitely not that. And I think I see this a lot with a lot of people online who have really taken up egoism. Very quick to, so we live in a world of very clear spooks, spirits, family structure, school, state, relatively authoritarian structures, and I think from that becomes this sort of angsty, like I'll do the opposite thing, right? A lot of egoism ends up going, right, to be a Stirnerite, to be an egoist is to shoplift, right? It's like, nah, there's very like I need an idol, but just not the one that I do, and you're constantly this bouncing around and the difficulty of. But one thing I want to mention, just before we get too far away from Nietzsche, just thinking on that. I'm right in thinking one of the last bits of correspondence from Stirner was someone wrote to him about a poem that they'd wrote. Someone, must be such an odd thing to do. Someone, I think it's from McKay, I think. Someone wrote to him about a poem, a young, I guess, student wrote to Stirner about a poem that they'd written. And it was to do with God and the church. And Stirner wrote back saying, like, this is really to do with heroism. But the thing that stood out to me that was interesting about it was, because this poem was about the church, Stirner said something this is paraphrase, along the lines of, I don't know why you've written about the church and God. I mean, we all know that they're just not the things they are. Right, so his God is dead is so like, just like a shrug, like, oh, come on, we all know that's, like, he doesn't even bother with, whereas Nietzsche's got these grand theatrics, like, God is dead and we have killed him. Like, just calm down, we already know, let's move, So Stirner, I don't know, he just wants to get to live in.
Yeah, enjoy yourself. Live yourself out as well. I mean, I remember when I first read that notion of live yourself out. I'm like, oh, I only just encountered Stirner. I read that, and you kind of feel like you need to read that in the nihilistic mode, right? Like there is no, so just wait for death, But it's not. It is a call to kind of go out and touch grass. It's like, yeah, all the ideals, they're all, none of them, there's no meaning to any of them. You actually all created them yourself. You're a product of your own mind. They're your property. Just take ownership of them. and accept the fact that if they bring you joy, Mary Kondo, if it brings you joy, keep it. If it doesn't spark joy, then throw it away.
Yeah. This is exactly one thing I wanted to bring in, because at the start, I don't know, this is a real sort of scholarship question. This notion of putting the ego in its own and Stirner saying, oh, he's a post-Hegelian philosophy. Well, absolutely he is, right? That's undeniable. But you read the book, and when I've been reading it recently, the moments where he's like, okay, now I'll tackle Feuerbach or whoever it might be. He's very begrudging about it, and those sections are very, very short in comparison to. And now let's get back to the fun stuff of destroying, right? And so I can't remember what scholar it is. I mean, this is on the Wikipedia where someone reads Stirner in this way. But I think The Unique in His Property is the best self-help book ever written. I don't know how you feel about that.
That's great. Where were you when I was looking for blurbs for the back of the book? That's fantastic.
Well, I mean, you seem the same way that if I'm feeling anxious, I read a section of it and I go, oh, man, that's so good. It's really cathartic.
Yeah, I know what you mean about those Hegelian moments, and they're also where the joy is, because most of them are. I subscribe. There are a few people who subscribe to the view that most of those Hegelian bits are parody, that he is producing. I mean, the structure of the book directly echoes Feuerbach's The Essence of Christianity. He inverts that kind of. He inverts Feuerbach's inversion, where Feuerbach says that the godly aspects, the godliness is actually, they're the best aspects of being human. So to aspire to be godly is actually to aspire to be human. So therefore we should all aspire to be human. That he inverts God and man. And then, Stirner inverts man and I, and says, that everything that you aspire to be in man, I already am, because I'm me. I'm the unman. I am the individual. You're just a label. You're an abstract idea. Your man is just an abstract idea, this kind of collective humanity that doesn't exist. And so I reject that. I am me. He needs to go through these parodic he needs to do that dialectical kind of motion to get at what he's doing, right? Which is to dismantle the dialectic, to demonstrate that there are no contraries. The dialectic doesn't work for Stirner because the dialectic presupposes that there are contraries to operate against each other. There are no contraries. There is me. I am the only thing that is, and everything in the universe that I experience is a product of my own mind. Yes, there may be other beings out there, and I should I should be nice because they might be, and if I'm not, then I'm probably being a jerk. Maybe don't be a jerk. But I can't cross that bridge. I can't cross the bridge to the object, let alone cross the bridge from the object to another subject. So I'm going to have a good time. I'm here for a good time, not a long time.
Has egoism done more harm or good?
The interpretations of egoism have definitely done more harm. I don't think egoism, because egoism can't justify anything apart from saying, I will it, therefore it is. The idea that egoism could be justified to kill anybody, egoism could serve as a justification for killing people, which it has. It has been used as a justification for terrorist acts. It has been used as justification for tyranny. It makes me think of Feuille under D'Annunzio's control, where he has people playing live fire exercises with live hand grenades, and people, shrapnel wounds, and he's doing that for a lark. I mean, it's hard to justify that, but it's also hard to justify the alternative, I suspect. To read morality, it's Herbert Reed who suggests that morality has to read in one of two ways, right? Morality has to read socially, or it has to read individually. There was a third option. The third option was God, but most of us don't have access to that third option anymore. If you read morality socially, it's inevitably going to run towards tyranny, um, because it is social values governing the behavior of the individual. It's tyranny. Social morality can't help but be tyranny. Individual morality, Reid suggests, I don't know I entirely agree with him, but Reid suggests that inevitably moves towards hedonism. And like we see that in the Denoncian kind of excess and violence and just craziness. And he proposes that we can't go, morality can't be social. If we go that way, we can't accept that level of tyranny. But we can't accept the excesses of an egoistic morality either. So we need something at least like, but that is a better option. We need something to temper it. And that's where you get to sort of what you might call aesthetic egoism, which is where he kind of raises that concept, which is that we must temper the hedonist potentially, because it's only hedonistic if that's what you go for. If you're in for hedonism, but the things start to fall back on themselves at that point. But we can temper hedonism with the notion of beauty or art, or making life beautiful. So that's not to answer your question about good or bad, but I'd say that the person who uses egoism to make their life beautiful might go at least some of the way to make up for all of the people who've used egoism to justify hurling grenades at people or dominating people or writing manifestos to hedge people in. Yeah. Okay. I think just one beautiful life is at least, I don't want to get into the calculus, but if egoism makes someone's life beautiful, then I think it might be worth it.
Is it, are the times ripe for another Stirner revival?
I hope so. I'll sell more books. No, I worry the times are ripe for a Stirner revival, but it's not the kind of Stirner revival I just described. In
both directions, but probably less so.
Yeah. Okay. One can't help but see a degree of Stirnerian egoism in the concept of post-truth. In that idea that facts are whatever serves my purpose in a given moment. And in an age where we have more control over the depiction of reality, probably than through, whether it's through media, whether it's through developments in AI, all of those things in large language models. We live in an age where it's ever easier to shift the dial on what one might call truth or an agreed upon truth. I can't help but see Stirner in that and see that kind of reading of that opportunistic reading of Stirner. That one that sees Stirner as a tool to be wielded against other people.
Is there anything you'd like to add about your book that you feel is key that we haven't touched upon?
No, I think we've done it service. I mean, I don't want to give away too much.
Oh no, exactly.
I need some. Yeah.
If you are interested more like in the more of the details of other figures and historical movements that have been influenced by Stirner, I mean, we've only really covered a couple, like with D'Annunzio and.
If you're interested in futurism, if you're interested in data, if you're interested in symbolism, if you're interested in anarchism, 18th, 19th century French anarchism, and kind of how Stirner plugged into all of those scenes, and how I think I say at one point that weirdly, like, he's never far from view. He never quite disappears. Wherever you find the manifesto's early development, there's always like, and that's what the book is about. And it sort of traces those two histories: Stirner's second reception, and the development of the manifesto in the late 19th and early 20th century, up until the war. As I said, the world stops existing for me after the war. That's
okay. So I'll put the links for the Ego Made Manifest in the description below from Bloomsbury, and also other places. What are you working on now?
I am working on Arthur Desmond, who we talk about bad egoists, we talk about bad Stirnerians. That we have some listeners may better know. I think you better knew Arthur Desmond as by one of his pseudonyms, Ragnar Redbeard, who authored a little book called Might is Right or Survival of the Fittest, which is probably if you want to talk about those oppressive. Not necessarily oppressive, but those domineering readings of kind of Stirnerian egoism. It's hard to go past Desmond's work, which influenced all kinds and continues to influence all kinds. Interesting guy. Started out, listeners might not know this, that he started out as a Maori civil rights activist in New Zealand before penning what is arguably one of the most influential works of white nationalism to be written in English.
Wow. So it's going to be a full length. It's going to be a full length book.
Hopefully, I'm working on the first chapter at the moment. I'll be presenting on it here in Australia at a conference in July at the Australian Society, the Association for the Study of Australian Literature conference at the University of Western Sydney. Keep an eye out. Look forward to seeing some work on Desmond and his poetry, because he was a poet. That's what I'm interested in. I'm a literary scholar, so I want to see how that Stirnerian egoism translates into poetry, which is generally not very good. Think of if you want to look up an Australian bush poet, Henry Lawson. He may not like being called a bush poet, but if you want to look up Henry Lawson, imagine that combined with the economic poetry of Ezra Pound, and you're starting to approach something a bit like what Desmond wrote.
Well, when that book is released, I'd love to talk to you about it. But I feel this is a good place to finish up. Wayne Bradshaw, it's been a pleasure. Thanks very much.
It's been a pleasure in this end too. Thank you, James.